Princess Velithra Kinsar stood at the tall window of the Valorian Imperial Palace and watched the human transport ship descend through the purple clouds of her world. She felt disgust rise in her chest like bitter water. Humans were coming to her home, and she could do nothing to stop it. Her father, the great Emperor Kinsar, had signed a trade agreement with the Terran Coalition just 3 months ago. And now these creatures from that toxic death world called Earth were arriving as honored guests. Velithra turned away from the window and let out a sound of frustration. "My lady," her attendant Mirith said softly, "the Emperor requests your presence in the reception hall." "I am aware," Velithra replied coldly. "I simply need a moment to prepare myself for the smell." She had heard stories about humans her entire life, and none of them were pleasant. They were violent creatures who had nearly destroyed their own planet through war and pollution. They lived barely 100 years before dying. They ate the flesh of other animals, and they came from a world so dangerous that most species could not survive there for even a single day. Why her father wanted anything to do with such primitives was beyond her understanding. She walked through the crystal corridors of the palace with her head held high. She was the third daughter of the Emperor, often overlooked and rarely valued, but she still had her pride, and she would not let these humans see any weakness. The reception hall was filled with Valorian nobles when she arrived, their tall, slender forms draped in flowing robes of silver and gold. The Valorians were an ancient and beautiful people with skin that shimmered like moonlight and eyes that glowed with soft inner light. They had ruled their corner of the galaxy for 10,000 years, and they considered themselves the most civilized species in existence. The humans looked so out of place among them. There were only 6 of them standing in a small group near the entrance. They were shorter than Valorians, with strange solid-colored skin in various shades of brown and pink, and they wore simple dark uniforms that seemed almost offensive in their plainness. Velithra's father stood before them with a diplomatic smile on his face. "Ah, my daughter," he said as she approached. "Come and greet our guests from Earth." She forced herself to bow her head slightly, the minimum gesture of respect required by protocol. "Welcome to Valoria," she said in a voice that held no warmth. The human ambassador, a woman with gray hair and sharp eyes, smiled and returned the bow more deeply. "Thank you, Princess Velithra. We are honored to be here." Velithra noticed one of the humans standing slightly apart from the others. He was a man of medium height with black hair and calm dark eyes, and he wore a different uniform than the diplomats, one that marked him as military. He stood with perfect stillness, watching everything around him with quiet attention. "That is Sergeant Yoon So-jin," the ambassador said, noticing her gaze. "He leads our security team during this visit." Velithra looked at the soldier with open contempt. "I was not aware humans felt they needed protection here. Do you think us savages who would harm guests in our own home?" The ambassador's smile faltered, but the soldier simply met Velithra's eyes without any change in his expression. "It is standard procedure." "Your Highness," he said in a voice that was surprisingly gentle, "we mean no offense to your people or your hospitality, and yet offense is taken." Velithra replied sharply. Her father placed a hand on her shoulder in warning, but she ignored it. "Perhaps you should keep your soldiers on a shorter leash, Ambassador. We would not want them to act on their famous human instincts for violence." The room grew quiet, and several Valorian nobles exchanged uncomfortable glances. The insult was clear and deliberate, and everyone knew it, but Sergeant Yoon So-jin did not react with anger as Velithra expected. Instead, he tilted his head slightly and asked a simple question. "Your Highness, may I ask what you know of Earth?" Velithra blinked, surprised by the question. "I know enough," she said coldly. "I know it is a death world where everything tries to kill everything else. I know your species nearly destroyed yourselves with wars and weapons. And I know you eat other living creatures like animals. Saijin nodded slowly. Those things are true, he said. But I wonder if you have ever asked why we survived all of that. Valithra felt something strange then, a small crack in her certainty. But she pushed it away and lifted her chin. I have no interest in the survival stories of primitives, she said. Now, if you will excuse me, I have duties to attend to. She turned and walked away, not waiting for a response, but as she left the reception hall, she found that she could not stop thinking about the human soldier's question. His voice had been so calm, so free of anger or hurt, and his eyes had held something she did not expect. He had looked at her, not with fear or hatred, but with something that almost seemed like understanding. It made her uncomfortable in ways she could not explain that night. Valithra stood again at her window and watched the lights of the human quarters across the palace grounds. She told herself that she felt nothing but disgust for them, that they were beneath her notice, that one strange question from a primitive soldier meant nothing at all, but somewhere deep inside, in a place she did not want to examine, a small seed of doubt had been planted, and whether she wanted it or not, that seed had already begun to grow. 3 days after the humans arrived, everything changed. Valithra was summoned to her father's private chambers in the middle of the night, and she knew immediately that something was wrong. The Emperor never called for her unless there was trouble. There has been a threat against your life, her father said without any greeting. Our intelligence suggests the Krev Syndicate plans to assassinate you during the journey to the neutral trade station. Valithra felt cold fear grip her heart, but she kept her face calm. Then I will travel with additional Valorian guards, she said. That is not possible, her father replied. The Syndicate has infiltrated our security forces, and we do not know who can be trusted. You will travel with the human delegation instead, as no one will expect a Valorian princess to hide among humans. Absolutely not. Valithra shouted, losing her composure for the first time in years. I will not lower myself to travel with those creatures. Her father's eyes grew hard. You will do as I command, he said in a voice that allowed no argument. This is not a request, Valithra. This is an order from your emperor. And so, just 2 days later, Princess Valithra found herself aboard the human transport vessel Steady Horizon, surrounded by the very beings she despised most. The ship was small compared to Valorian vessels, and everything about it felt crude and mechanical. There was no crystal, no flowing architecture, just metal walls and harsh lighting and the constant hum of primitive engines. She had been given a small cabin near the human quarters, and she spent the first day refusing to leave it on the second day. Hunger drove her to the common eating area. She expected chaos and noise, but what she found surprised her. The humans sat together at simple tables, eating and talking in low voices. There was laughter, but it was not the wild, savage laughter she had imagined. It was warm and gentle, the sound of friends enjoying each other's company. Sergeant Yoon Seo-jin sat with 3 other soldiers at a corner table, and Valithra watched him without meaning to. He was telling some kind of story, using his hands to illustrate his words, and his companions listened with smiles on their faces. One of the younger soldiers, a woman with red hair, said something that made Seo-jin laugh, and his whole face changed. The serious, calm expression broke into something bright and alive, and for just a moment, he looked almost handsome. Valithra caught herself staring and quickly looked away. She took a small amount of food that looked least offensive and sat alone at the far end of the room. She told herself she did not want company, that she was merely tolerating this situation until she reached safety, but she kept glancing at the humans, kept watching their strange and fascinating interactions. On the third day, the ship experienced a mechanical failure. Alarms screamed through the corridors, and red lights flashed everywhere. Valithra felt the vessel shake beneath her feet, and she grabbed the wall to keep from falling. Panic rose in her chest as she heard Valorian guards running past her door, shouting about protocol and emergency procedures. None of them stopped to check on her. None of them seemed to know what to do. Then her door opened, and Sergeant Yoon So-jin stood there. "Your Highness, please come with me to the engineering bay," he said calmly. "There is a coolant leak, and I need to help seal it before it becomes dangerous." "Why would you need my help?" she demanded. "I am not a mechanic." "I do not need your help with the repair," he said. "But you will be safer there than alone in your cabin. Please, trust me. Trust him," she thought bitterly. Trust a human, but the ship shook again, and she heard something crack in the walls around her. She followed him in the engineering bay. She saw something that would stay with her for the rest of her life. The human engineers were working together with perfect coordination, calling out instructions to each other without panic or fear. Seo-jin moved among them like he belonged there, handing tools and helping hold broken panels in place. At one point, a spray of hot steam burst from a damaged pipe, and Seo-jin simply wrapped his jacket around his hands and held the pipe closed while another engineer sealed it. She saw the pain on his face, saw that the heat was burning him even through the fabric. But he did not let go until the repair was complete. When it was over, Seo-jin sat on the floor with his burned hands resting on his knees, and he let out a long breath. "Are you injured?" the Lithra asked. Surprising herself with the question, he looked up at her and smiled despite his obvious pain. "Only a little," he said. "I have had worse." She did not know what to say, so she said nothing later. After the ship was stable and Seo-jin's hands were wrapped in bandages, she found him sitting alone in the observation room. Looking out at the stars, she sat down near him, close enough to talk but far enough to maintain her dignity. "Why did you do that?" she asked. "Why did you injure yourself for this ship?" Seo-jin was quiet for a moment. "On Earth," he said softly, "we have a saying that a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. Every person on this ship matters. Every life has value. And if I can protect them with a little pain, then that pain means something." The Lithra looked at his bandaged hands and felt something shift inside her heart. "You are strange creatures," she said quietly. "Yes," he agreed with a small smile. "We are. But we are also survivors, and we take care of each other." For the first time since meeting him, the Lithra did not argue. She simply sat with him in the darkness between the stars and allowed herself to wonder if perhaps, just perhaps, she had been wrong about humans all along. The neutral trade station hung in the empty space between three great empires, a massive structure of metal and light where species from across the galaxy came to negotiate, trade, and sometimes betray each other. Valithra had visited this station many times before, but this was the first time she truly paid attention to how other species treated humans. It was not pleasant to watch in the Grand Assembly Hall. Representatives from a dozen worlds gathered to discuss the new trade agreements. Valithra sat with the Valorian delegation, while the humans took their place at a small table near the back of the room. Far from the positions of honor, the Kreth ambassador, a massive creature covered in thick scales, spoke first. "I see the humans have been given seats at our table," he said with obvious disgust. "Perhaps next we will invite the animals from their zoos to join our discussions." Laughter rippled through the hall, and Valithra saw several species join in the mockery. The Telvanni clicked their mandibles in amusement, and the Orcs flashed their bioluminescent skin in patterns that signaled contempt. She waited for the humans to react, to shout or threaten or storm out of the room. This was their famous temper, their legendary violence, finally showing itself. But the human ambassador, the gray-haired woman named Chun, simply smiled. "The Honorable Kreth ambassador makes an interesting point," she said in a voice that carried across the hall. "Animals indeed have much to teach us. The Kreth, for example, share 92% of their genetic code with a creature from Earth called a crocodile. So perhaps we are not so different after all." The Kreth ambassador's scales flushed dark with anger. But before he could respond, Ambassador Chen continued, We humans do not ask for respect based on our age or our appearance. We ask only for the chance to prove our worth through our actions. And I believe that is a standard any civilized species would accept." The laughter died, and something like grudging respect appeared on several faces around the room. Valithra found herself staring at the human ambassador with new eyes. That had been clever. She realized, very clever indeed. Later that evening, she found Sergeant Sejan standing on one of the station's observation decks, looking out at the stars. She had been looking for him, though she would never admit it. "Your ambassador was impressive today," she said, coming to stand beside him. "Ambassador Chun is one of the finest diplomats humanity has ever produced," Seo Jin replied. "She has ended 3 wars with nothing but words. But why did she not strike back harder?" Valithra asked, genuinely confused. "The Kreth insulted your entire species, and she had the wit to destroy him. Why did she hold back?" Zanjin turned to look at her, his dark eyes thoughtful. "Because destroying him was not the goal," he said. "The goal was to be heard, to be taken seriously, to plant a seed of doubt in the minds of those who laughed. If she had truly crushed him, she would have made an enemy. Instead, she made him think." Valithra considered this for a long moment. "On Valoria, we believe that any insult must be answered with greater force," she said. "To do otherwise is to show weakness. And how many wars has that belief caused your people?" Eljin asked gently. She had no answer for that. They stood in silence for a while, watching ships come and go from the station. Something about Seo Jin's presence made Valithra feel calm in a way she rarely experienced. And without meaning to, she began to speak. "I am the 3rd daughter of the Emperor," she said quietly. "Do you know what that means?" "I imagine it is not an easy position," Sojin said. "It means I am invisible," she said. And she was surprised by the bitterness in her own voice. "My eldest sister will inherit the throne. My second sister commands our fleets. And I am simply kept around for diplomatic marriages and public events. My father barely remembers my name." She did not know why she was telling him this. She had never spoken these words to anyone on Earth. Sojin said softly, "There is another saying. The stars do not care about titles. They shine for everyone equally, and they do not ask permission to be beautiful." Valithra looked at him, not understanding. "It means that worth is not given by others," he explained. "It is not a gift your father can grant or withhold. It comes from inside you, from who you choose to be and what you choose to do. No one can take that away from you, Your Highness, no one." She felt something warm spread through her chest, something she had not felt in many years. It took her a moment to recognize it as hope. "You speak as if you believe that," she whispered. "I do believe it," he said. "And someday, you will believe it too." She turned back to the stars. But this time, she did not see the cold, empty darkness. She saw infinite possibility, infinite space for growth and change and becoming something new. "Seo Jin," she said. And it was the first time she had used his name without his title. "Why are you so kind to me? I have been nothing but cruel to you since we met." He smiled, that gentle smile she was beginning to look forward to seeing. "Because everyone deserves kindness," he said. "Especially those who have forgotten what it feels like." Valithra did not respond. She did not trust herself to speak without her voice breaking, but standing there beside him, watching the stars' wheels slowly past, she felt something inside her begin to heal. Something she had not even known was wounded, and for the first time in her life, she wondered if perhaps the universe was larger and more beautiful than her pride had allowed her to see. The attack came without warning. One moment, Valithra was walking through the station's commercial district, and the next, the world exploded into fire and screaming. She was thrown against the wall by the force of the blast, and her head struck metal with a sickening crack. For several seconds, She could not see or hear anything except bright white light and a high-pitched ringing in her ears. When her vision cleared, she saw chaos everywhere. Smoke filled the corridors, and bodies lay scattered across the ground. Alarms wailed in the distance, and she could hear weapons fire echoing from somewhere nearby the Krev Syndicate. She realized with horror. They had found her. She tried to stand, but her legs would not cooperate. Blood dripped down her face from a wound she could not feel, and the world kept tilting dangerously to one side. Princess. She looked up and saw Sergeant Yoon Seo-jin running toward her through the smoke. His uniform was torn and burned, and she could see blood on his arm, but he moved with determined speed. "We need to move now," he said, kneeling beside her. "Can you walk?" "I think so," she said, though she was not certain. He helped her to her feet and wrapped her arm around his shoulders, taking most of her weight. Together, they began to move through the burning corridor, away from the sounds of fighting. "Where are my guards?" she asked. "Dead or scattered," Seo-jin said grimly. "The Syndicate hit your section first. I think they knew exactly where to find you." Fear gripped her heart tighter than the pain in her head. "They will not stop hunting me," she whispered. "Then we keep moving," he said. "I will not let them take you." They stumbled through damaged hallways and broken doors, avoiding the main corridors where the fighting was heaviest. Yeo-jin seemed to know the station's layout perfectly, and Velithra wondered how he had memorized it so quickly. At one point, they came face to face with two Syndicate soldiers. Velithra barely had time to register their presence before Seo-jin moved. He released her gently against the wall, and then he was in motion. Faster than she could follow, the first soldier fell with a single precise strike to the throat. The second raised his weapon, but Seo-jin was already inside his guard, twisting the gun away and using it to end the fight in one brutal movement. It was over in 3 seconds. Seo-jin turned back to her, breathing hard, and his eyes were different now. They were cold and sharp, the eyes of a predator, and for just a moment, Velithra understood why other species feared humans. Then he blinked, and the gentleness returned. "Can you continue?" he asked. She nodded. Unable to speak, they moved on. The next hour was a blur of pain and fear and desperate flight. Twice more they encountered enemies, and twice more Seo-jin dealt with them with terrifying efficiency. By the time they reached a maintenance section, deep in the station's lower levels, Velithra had lost count of how many times this human had saved her life. But he was weakening. The wound on his arm was worse than she had realized, and she could see him growing pale from blood loss. He hit it well, but she had learned to read his face in the days they had spent together. "You are dying," she said as they stopped to rest in a dark storage room. "I am fine," he said, but his voice was strained. "You are lying," she replied. "I may be a princess raised in luxury, but I know what blood loss looks like." He managed a weak smile. "We just need to reach the emergency shuttles. Your people will be looking for you, and the human delegation will have called for support." A massive explosion shook the room, and part of the ceiling collapsed. Velithra saw it happening as if time had slowed. She saw the metal falling toward her, saw that there was no time to move, saw the certainty of her own death written in fire and steel, and then Seo-jin was there. He threw himself over her, wrapping his body around hers like a shield, and the debris struck him instead of her. She heard him cry out in pain, a terrible sound that cut through her soul. And then silence. "Seo-jin," she screamed. He did not move. She struggled out from beneath him and turned him over. His eyes were closed, and blood was spreading from a dozen wounds across his back. His breathing was shallow and weak, barely there at all. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no." She pressed her hands against the worst of his wounds, trying to stop the bleeding, but there was so much damage, too much for her to fix. "Why?" she demanded, even though he could not hear her. "Why did you do this for me? I treated you like dirt. I insulted your people. I showed you nothing but contempt. Why would you die for me?" His eyes fluttered open, just barely, and he looked up at her with something that might have been a smile. "Because you are worth saving," he whispered. "Because everyone deserves a chance to become better." Then his eyes closed again, and he went still. Valithra felt something break inside her, something that had been frozen for her entire life. Tears streamed down her face, real tears, the first she had shed since childhood, and she did not care who might see. She grabbed his hand and held it tight. "You will not die here," she said fiercely. "I will not allow it." She activated her royal emergency beacon, the one she had been too proud to use before, and she screamed into the communicator with all the authority and desperation in her soul. "This is Princess Valithra, Kinsar of the Valorian Empire. I require immediate medical evacuation for a human soldier who saved my life. Respond now." Static answered her, then a voice. Human and familiar. "Princess, this is the Terran vessel Horizon's Hope. We have your location and are en route. Hold on, we are coming." She clutched Seo Jin's hand tighter and watched his pale face in the dim light. "Hold on," she whispered to him. "Please hold on. I am not done learning from you yet." And in the darkness of that broken station, surrounded by fire and death, Princess Valithra finally understood what true strength really looked like. 3 weeks had passed since the attack on the neutral trade station. Princess Valithra stood in the human medical wing of the Valorian Imperial Palace, a place that had been hastily constructed at her personal demand. No one had questioned her when she insisted that Sergeant Yoon Seo Jin be brought here for his recovery instead of being sent back to Earth. No one dared question her about anything anymore. The attack had changed many things. The Krev Syndicate had been hunted down and destroyed by a joint force of Valorian and human ships. The trade agreement had been signed with more favorable terms for humanity than anyone expected. And Princess Valithra had become a different person entirely. Seo Jin lay in a bed surrounded by advanced medical equipment, both human and Valorian technology working together to heal his broken body. The doctors said he would survive, but he had nearly died 3 times during the journey back to Valoria each time. Valithra had refused to leave his side. Now, finally, his eyes were open, and he was looking at her with that gentle expression she had come to treasure. "Your Highness," he said, his voice weak but warm, "you should not be here. Surely you have more important duties." "There is nothing more important than this," she said. And she meant it. She sat down in the chair beside his bed, the same chair she had occupied for most of the past 3 weeks, and she took his hand in hers. It felt natural now, this contact with a human, this connection that would have disgusted her just a month ago. "The treaty was signed yesterday," she said. "Humanity has been granted full partner status in the Galactic Council." Your Ambassador Chun cried when she heard the news. Seo Jin smiled. "That is wonderful," he said. "She has worked her whole life for this. It would not have happened without you," Valithra said. "Without what you did, without who you are." He shook his head slightly. "I am just one soldier. I did not change the galaxy. You changed me," she said softly. "And that changed everything." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, and Valithra found herself thinking about all that had happened. She thought about her prejudice and her pride, about the walls she had built around her heart, about all the years she had wasted believing lies. "I need to apologize to you," she said finally. "Not just for how I treated you, but for everything I believed about your people. I was taught to see humans as animals, as monsters, as threats to be feared and controlled. I never questioned those teachings. I never looked beyond them, and because of that, I almost lost something precious." Seo Jin squeezed her hand gently. "You were raised in a certain world with certain beliefs," he said. "The fact that you were willing to see beyond them, to change and grow, that is what matters." "But I was so cruel," she whispered. How can you forgive me so easily? Because holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die, he said. Another Earth saying. We have many of them. She laughed, surprising herself. It was a real laugh, genuine and free. You humans and your sayings, she said. I think I will need a lifetime to learn them all. I would be happy to teach you, he said. Their eyes met. And something passed between them, something deeper than friendship, but too new to name. Valithra felt her heart beat faster, and she knew that her life would never be the same a week later. Sejun was well enough to walk through the palace gardens. The human delegation was preparing to return to Earth, and their time together was running short. Valithra found him standing beneath a crystal tree, watching the twin suns set over the mountains. Tomorrow you leave, she said, coming to stand beside him. Yes, he said. My duties call me home. Will you ever return? She asked, and she hated how vulnerable her voice sounded. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. It was a simple pendant on a thin chain, carved from dark wood into the shape of a leaf. This is from a tree in Korea, the land where I was born, he said. It is nothing valuable, but it is precious to me. I want you to have it. Valithra took the pendant with trembling hands. Why? She asked. Because I want you to remember, he said. Not me specifically, but what we learned together. I want you to remember that people can change, that enemies can become friends, that the universe is full of wonders if we are brave enough to see them. She closed her fingers around the pendant and pressed it to her heart. I will remember, she promised. And I will make sure others remember too. The next day, the human delegation gathered in the transport bay to say their farewells. Ambassador Chun embraced Valithra like a daughter, and even the red-haired soldier who had laughed at Sojin's stories smiled. At her with genuine warmth. Seojin was the last aboard the ship. He stopped at the entrance and turned back to look at her one final time. Until we meet again. Princess, he said. Until we meet again, she replied. And Seojin? Thank you. Thank you for everything. He smiled that gentle smile. And then he was gone. Valithra watched the human ship rise through the purple clouds and disappear into the sky. She stood there long after it had vanished, holding the wooden pendant and feeling the weight of everything she had learned. That evening, she did something she had never done before. She requested an audience with her father and the Imperial Council. I wish to address the matter of human relations, she said, standing before the highest powers of her empire. I have seen firsthand who they truly are, and I believe we have much to learn from each other. Her father looked at her with surprise, and perhaps for the first time. With respect, speak, he said. Valithra spoke. She told him about human courage and compassion, about their strength and their wisdom, about a simple soldier who had nearly died to save someone who had shown him only contempt. She spoke with passion and conviction, and when she finished, the council chamber was silent. Humanity is not our enemy, she concluded. They are our partners, our allies, and perhaps our greatest teachers. I propose that we open our worlds to each other fully, not just in trade, but in culture and education. In friendship, the debate lasted for hours, but in the end, the council voted in her favor as Valithra left the chamber that night. She looked up at the stars and touched the wooden pendant at her throat. Somewhere out there, among those infinite points of light, a ship was carrying Sergeant Yoon Se-jin back to Earth. She did not know if she would ever see him again, but she knew that, because of him, she would spend the rest of her life building bridges between their worlds. And one changed mind had already begun to change everything. The stars seemed to shine a little brighter, and Princess Valithra finally understood that she was exactly where she was meant to be.